it's been a tough 2020. Good afternoon, good evening, and I guess good morning to some of you. Um, yes, so my name is Chris Farrell, and my primary role is head of training and development. And in that role, in our centres, we've got 6 centres in the UK, 1 centre in Ireland, and 1 centre in Toronto in Canada. We've obviously through 2020 been looking at pivoting into an online teaching context, and now back into a socially distant context. So we've done a lot of teacher training and analysis of the needs of different contexts. And throughout the last 8-9 months, we've kind of gone through a huge shift, as most institutions who've been affected by COVID have. And I guess today what we're going to look at a little bit is some of the learnings from this shift, and some of the things, the mistakes that we made maybe, and the mistakes that we can learn from. And I'm going to hopefully share, you're going to hopefully share some of your opinions with me as well. I want to focus on a couple of different sections in particular, and I think rooted kind of right at the center of any consideration of online teaching, face-to-face teaching, whatever teaching context you're going to look at, is the role of the teacher and what we expect the teacher to be able to do on a consistent basis in the classroom. If we're an institution, have we ensured that we've prepared the teacher appropriately for the context? And if we are teaching, as I guess a lot of you are, we want to ensure that we're fully aware of what our fundamental role is in the classroom, vis-a-vis the material, vis-a-vis the students, vis-a-vis assessment and stuff like that. So we really need to go back to basics and understand what is the role of the teacher in the online context, for example. Secondly, and quite tied in with the role of the teacher, is this concept of monitoring and assessment. We look at this from not only a lesson planning context, but also a classroom management perspective. And this is actually, I guess, fundamentally the learning outcomes that we set and we expect and we assess in a face-to-face context. Are they the same in an online context? So traditionally, the lessons that we have been setting up and the way we have been setting up the students for progress and for success, are they directly transferable, or do we need to reconsider how we're going to, categorize success and then monitor success in the classroom? And similarly, at a fundamental level within a classroom, how are you monitoring the success of different stages in the lesson? In a face-to-face classroom, we have this experience of monitoring and understanding different tasks, maybe reading, listening, or writing. But in a online context, we have to utilize certain tools, and we have to understand how these tools are experienced by the student and how they are helping us monitor student learning. Thirdly, probably in a similar context to a lot of people here today that might have entered 2020 as technophobes, and then had to embrace technology not only as a useful tool for teaching, but actually something which may be able to enhance learning in the classroom and may be able to encourage learner independence, for example. So we do want to look at how we can utilize technology and not just live with it in this context. Fundamental to our change into online teachers is the institutional support, and actually bringing the apparatus of the institution with us in an online context. I know in a lot of situations for teachers in 2020, they ended up online with their students, but the school didn't follow them. So they were the only point of contact for their students. They had no real support, development process, support with behavioral issues, anything like that just wasn't provided because the institutional apparatus wasn't geared towards the online context. And this is something which needs to be fundamentally changed. I think in 2020, we've done it quickly, and I think it's time for institutions to do it properly. If they are serious about supporting teachers in an online context, they need to look at having policies on safeguarding, on other areas like this, which are fundamental to the administration, I suppose, of a school. We also want to look at the learner's experience and how the learner has experienced the growth or the development of online learning throughout this year, how they're engaging with material, how they're understanding their own assessment processes, how they're really feeling as students. Are they enjoying online lessons, or is it something which they see as of less value, or they see it as perhaps temporary? And we do really need to get the learner's voice more and more, and understand how they are experiencing the lessons, primarily because most of us as teachers haven't experienced online lessons, or at least a huge amount of online lessons. So we don't really know a lot of the time what our lessons look like for students, unless we get involved in things like peer observation, or we include the student voice in our reflection and considerations. And lastly, I'm not going to try and make any sweeping predictions, because I think if I had tried to make similar predictions at this time last year, I would have been massively wrong. But we will look a little bit at what this year has done potentially to future developments in the educational sector. And I do think, quite especially, that the quick move to online has let the genie out of the bottle in terms of online learning, and in terms of technology in the classroom. And I do think, for one, the experience has been positive for some people, and they've learned a lot and learned how to utilize certain technological tools. But for others, maybe they can see that online learning, online teaching is just not for them. It's something that they don't really enjoy. They don't feel that they're they don't feel a passion for it, I think, at all, maybe. So they're the 6 different areas we're going to look at. We're going to start with the role of the teacher. And I think kind of at the core of this, and it's at the core of a lot of training programs and the development of training programs. And it's this big difference between what we were trying to do and now currently what we're expected to do. Majority of teachers were trained as face-to-face teachers, and perhaps they were trained as face-to-face teachers of adults. And the role that they find themselves in is not exactly what they thought teaching was going to look like, and perhaps they weren't prepared fully for certain aspects of that job. And I do think it's important for the institution to really consider what aspects of the job are we now expecting teachers to do, which they're not trained to do, and how can we ensure that they receive appropriate training for those aspects. So these bridging competencies are something which not only institutions, but I think as a sector, as an industry, it's something which would be really, really helpful in order to ensure that the quality which teachers are able to provide in a face-to-face context is easily transferable into this online context. I think further to this, and this is one big debate, I think, which is ongoing, is the teacher's move from face-to-face into online a complete shift in role? So does it create a couple of different roles for the teacher, and are some other roles now redundant, or is it just an execution change? So is it similar roles, but they're executed in different ways? So within a traditional face-to-face classroom, the 6 roles listed here would be quite typical for a teacher, whether in an adult context, young learner context, exam context, general English. The teacher would be expected to be a facilitator, a model of language, an assessor, a planner, a manager, and a guide. Are these still relevant in an online context, or are they relevant but with a slight change in how they are actually done? And I think obviously that debate can go back and forth, but I think fundamentally we have to understand how these roles are actually done in the classroom, in an online classroom, and how we can ensure that teachers are supported and trained enough to do those roles appropriately. So I really think rooted at the fundamentals of successful online teaching is understanding the context which the teacher is being expected to teach in, understanding the role which is expected of the teacher, and providing support and training towards fulfilling that role kind of effectively and comprehensively, I suppose. And I think with that in mind, there's 2 key skills, or maybe just buzzwords, which we should always think about for future development of training courses and teacher development sessions, either in the school or at a national level or something like that. This is flexibility and adaptability. because the number of skills which obviously you have learned this year are very, very transferable from a face-to-face context. But it's just understanding that transferability and being able to adapt and be flexible with this transferability, and to understand the key fundamentals of pedagogy, and to bring them into whatever context is appropriate for you. So I think training courses in the future, if we again look at kind of future proofing yourself as a teacher or an institution, I think flexibility and adaptability of pedagogical knowledge, of pedagogical application, I think is crucial now. It should have been crucial, and it will be quite crucial, I think. When we look at the role of the teacher and how training programs are set up to encourage teachers or train teachers to fulfill certain roles, we always go back to competency frameworks. Competency frameworks typically form the basis for a lot of training programs, whether they're preparatory training programs, long-term university training programs, or short further development programs. And this is taken from the Equals Teacher Development Framework, and it looks at teacher competency in 5 different areas. And this is typically focused on teaching in a face-to-face context. So what we have to do as institutions and as teachers is to see which areas are not actually focused on, which areas which are required now in an online context, and they're not actually focused on in a competency framework, and see how we can begin to fill the gaps and bridge some of these areas. You know, we can see here in teaching and supporting learning, there's the use of digital media, and perhaps this could be expanded upon. There's very little focus on IT skills, which perhaps in our new context, there should be an explicit focus on. That's just an idea. We move from the role of the teacher onto monitoring and assessment. And as I said before, this is one of the roles of the teacher, and obviously with face-to-face context, the teacher is constantly setting out achievable learning outcomes, monitoring these learning outcomes, and then perhaps in the longer term, assessing success of learning outcomes as they go on. What we're particularly focused on today is this classroom management aspect, and in particular, what are called key teacher contact points, these KTPs. And key teacher contact points are essentially every time the lesson comes back to the teacher. So every time the lesson comes back to the teacher, what is the teacher doing to progress learning in the lesson? So it could be instructions, it could be collecting feedback, giving feedback, it could be correcting, it could be concept checking, things like that. Every time the lesson comes back, how is the teacher progressing learning? These are really fundamental pedagogical skills, and with the teacher's ability to monitor and progress the lesson, these key teacher contact points become quite essential. And we're looking at if these are as transferable into an online context. So I want to think about your context and how you have been teaching online, and these particular key teacher contact points: giving instructions, concept checking, lexis or grammar structure, getting feedback from students on certain things, correcting errors, and nominating students. So rather than having open class, actually nominating students individually. I want you to go to the chat box. I want you to think of one of these contact points. So one thing which you do as a teacher in an online context, and how you do it. So how do you give instructions that might be different to a face-to-face, or how do you correct that might be different to a face-to-face context? Just going to give you a minute or two to go to the chat and think, how do you do these things in an online context? And I can, again, steal some ideas from you, hopefully. Google Forms. I like Google has been a bit of a savior this year. Google Forms, Google Classroom, interactive worksheets, great. Yes, it really has. Microsoft Forms, it's the big competitor, Google and Microsoft Forms. Nearpod comes up again and again. Clear instructions. So correction, use the chat for correction, peer-to-peer correction. Interesting. Instructions in the main room, clear instructions. Kahoot and Quizlet. So it's important as well for you to be able to see that this is in the chat box now. It's a community of teachers who are doing the exact same thing as you are there, and they're kind of trying to find solutions to the same problems that you're trying to find solutions to. So I would suggest scanning the chat throughout this session and looking at some of the different tools and ideas which people have suggested, and see if you can try them out in your classroom. Zoom and the chat box, virtual whiteboard for instructions. I think written instructions in the chat or in a whiteboard is really, really useful. Word wall, Google Classroom, Google Forms. Record video tutorials for younger learners. That's great. And you can keep them going forward. Jamboard, PowerPoint presentations. That's great. Some really good idea. Microsoft, really good ideas. Still coming in. Google Classroom. And you can see even teachers who are in very different countries and perhaps different contexts are using some of the same tools. And I presume that's true trial and error. You know, you have tried out a lot of different things and you found that actually Google Classroom and Google Forms and Microsoft Teams, they're all really useful. Quizlet, Mentimeter, screen sharing scores and painting them. Wow. Wow. Edpuzzle as well. Wow, that's great for nomination. Some really good ideas. So you can see one of the things we really, really need, and this set up by National Geographic is kind of a really good step along the way, but it's actually a community of practice which focuses on creating models of best practice for online learning. Because frequently we kind of have an idea of how we do it and maybe how our colleagues do it, but we're trying to see, is this actually the best way to give instructions? Is it the best way to get feedback? Are other people doing it differently, or is it better? And I really do think it's a time to kind of reach out to teachers in other contexts and see what's working for them and collaborate with them. If possible, could be something interesting for National Geographic to set up. Okay, you can keep putting in your ideas, and I'm going to just move on if you don't mind. Thumbs up, I like it. With monitoring and assessment, I think we have a couple of considerations. I think if we go away from classroom management for a second and look at lesson planning, we typically understand learner progress and certainly progress through certain levels in a face-to-face context, and maybe our experience and our training helps us to understand the pace the progress could happen at, and certain markers the students are going to meet on their way, I suppose. And these might not be so evident in the online context, and actually what you think is, you know, maybe 6 hours of teaching in a face-to-face context, it mightn't exactly translate to the same type of power, I suppose, in an online context. So these are some considerations. We also have to look at something like visible learning. When we think about visible learning in a face-to-face context, you know, the most classic example of visible learning is obviously we're trying to see what's happening in the classroom as quickly as possible. So something like a traffic light scheme is quite common, where at certain junctures in the class, you ask the students how they are progressing. Are they understanding the language a little bit better? And they have a green if they're happy to proceed. They have amber, orange if they want a little bit more explanation, and red if they're completely lost, and they can just put them up and you can get an idea of generally how the class is doing. And there's no reason why some of the key aspects and ideas of visible learning can't be transferred into an online context. These could be really, really helpful in terms of the speed and your ability to monitor what's actually happening in the classroom. Similarly, I know people have been talking about Mentimeter. A Mentimeter is a really good visible learning tool in an online context, can help you get feedback quite quickly. We also have to consider learner development, learner skill development. And I'm not just talking about systemic knowledge, grammar knowledge, lexical knowledge, but actually skill development and what that might look like. And I guess with our experience, we understand what development in certain reading skills or writing skills might look like in a face-to-face context. And we just have to, I guess, reassess our expectations of how learners are going to engage with reading material in an online context, you know, rather than on a page, and how learners are going to engage with audio in this context, or speaking skills, development of speaking skills when it's through a microphone rather than actually using paralinguistic features in a group context. So our expectation of what type of skills we can develop, how quickly we can develop them, what to focus on in terms of development, and the potential barriers to development which the learners might be experiencing. These are all key aspects of our comprehension of learner progress, and they feed into our monitoring and assessment of the context. We also have the unknown of digital literacy and how people are actually using tech and engaging with tech, and whether the technology is helping them, it's masking things, or it's hindering their engagement with the material, engagement with the learning outcome, and things like that. It's just an unknown that we haven't got the experience as a profession, I suppose, to factor into our decision-making process. So these are important considerations, I suppose. And they're important in the bigger picture. The bigger picture for any sort of lesson, any sort of course, basically is: can we select appropriate learning outcomes for each lesson? Can we get an understanding of what success looks like in those learning outcomes? Can we assess that? And how do we react? Just to go through that with examples, our learning outcome could be, at a higher level, I want the students to write an academic essay. I want them to write an academic essay. That's my learning outcome. What does success look like? So what does that learning outcome look like? It looks like 200 words where they have advantage and disadvantage. They have an opinion at the end, and they have 7 signpost or linking words. So that's what I want. That's what I'm going to deem as success in this lesson. How am I going to assess it? I'm going to get them to write in a page. I'm going to collect the page, and I'm going to mark it in the evening or something like that, and I'm going to react appropriately. And we know that routine, it's fairly automatic for us through all different types of lessons. And we just need to rethink it in an online context. Is that learning outcome appropriate for an online context? Yeah, maybe. They have to write an essay. Success criteria, we want them to write this many words. Okay, they're going to be typing, so slight consideration. They're going to be advantage, disadvantage. They're going to have the internet to research if they want. So that could be, it could be a help, it could be a hindrance. In terms of assessment, I'm not going to be able to collect the pieces of paper. So maybe I'm going to get them to do it on a Google document, share the document in the chat with me. And as they're writing, I can go in and I can check what they're writing about, maybe give them some advice. And then by the time they're finished, they can send the links to their classmates, and they can peer assess or peer correct or something like that. And this could be a way of just rethinking how this process is done in an online context. It doesn't have to be completely different. It just has to be slightly reconsidered, whether each step is the same as it would be in a face-to-face context. And this feeds into our expectations versus our reality. So what do we expect the class to look like in a face-to-face context? But then the reality of the online context obviously changes that a little bit. And we have to use both the expectation and the reality to create these models of best practice on a consistent basis. And again, this comes down to reflection as a teacher on your own practice, and collaboration with other teachers engaged in a similar context. The next section we want to look at is the idea of technology as a friend. So technology is something which you can utilize, and it will be hopefully useful for you. And typically when we're choosing tools or platforms for online learning, we have 2 different types or categories, we can say, of online tool. The first is tools which generally provide us with content. So this could be websites which provide you with grammar games or grammar exercises, or reading text or something like that you can use, you can share with students. And then the other platforms or virtual learning environments, and this is frequently they're asynchronous spaces where the class can live away from the live lesson space. So Google Classroom is the most typical VLE, one of the most common platform. I know we're talking about Teams in the chat as well. So I just want you again to go to the chat and to share one of either of these that you use. So one tool that maybe you use for content that you say, oh, this is really good reading exercises, this is really good listening exercises, or whatever. Or one platform that you use as a virtual learning environment, to share material, to create collaborative tasks with the students. So I just want you to go to the chat and to share your tools, please. Google Docs, Seesaw, G Suite, YouTube. You're going to see G Suite and Google Classroom again and again. Big blue button, I like. Very like YouTube. ISL Collective, really, really good. MS Teams, Padlet, Classera, great. And you can see from this, guys, there's probably, for content, there's probably a lot more websites and tools we can use for content. But for platforms, there's probably 6 or 7 which are really, really useful. 6 or 7 which you can use, without much stress, and the students can log into quite easily. And they're kind of tried and tested, I suppose. PB Works is a great platform. Live Worksheet, Kahoot, Mentimeter, super. Some great ones. And again, guys, go back through the chat, look at what everyone else has said, and you can take some of the ideas and see how they work for you. Good stuff. Flipgrid, I really Flipgrid is quite a useful VLE, especially for young learners. I think it's more common for younger learners. I have trialed a lot of these different content forums and platforms and VLEs, and we've used them internally in our 8 centers, and I've created a couple of videos on how to use some of the tools. So I've included a lot of them in the ones that you've talked about. I've done. If you want to follow that QR code, it takes you to a YouTube channel where I've put some of these ideas on it, and I'm hopefully going to do a lot more next year if I just figure out how to use a lot more of these tools. Some great ideas, guys. Thanks. Okay. And again, I'll share the slides with you so you can use that code again and again. If it will let me go to the next page. Yeah. With technology, I think some of the areas of frustration which a lot of teachers felt initially, especially in the spring and summer, was tech failure, or a lack of their, I guess, competency with using certain aspects of technology. So like if you brought a CD or a cassette or whatever to class and it didn't work, you're going to have a backup plan. You're going to have something that you will do if the tech fails. And I think, again, with flexibility and adaptability, it's thinking, if this technology doesn't work, is there another way I can achieve the learning outcome? I can actually do my class. Because if we become really over reliant on certain things, like certain tools, certain platforms, and they don't work, that's when we get frustrated, and that's when we start to blame the technology, when in reality we should have a backup plan. We should have a plan B. We also have to consider generational differences, maybe cultural differences as well, in how people might like to engage or use technology, or how people might, how comfortable people might be in certain technological aspects. I suppose you take something like reading, younger generation might be more proficient or more comfortable reading online, reading on the phone, something like that, whereas older generation might not be. So these are just considerations when we're using technology. How are students actually engaging with it, and are they comfortable with it, or is it a barrier to progression? Is it a barrier to language learning? We also really have to consider access and inclusivity, and this is not just to do with Wi-Fi and things like that, and cameras, and whether turning your camera off is going to help with your connectivity, but it's also ensuring that we're not choosing any paid sites for technology. We're not excluding people because of economic reasons, or have any other unforeseen circumstances. So it's, I guess, to ensure that anything you are doing is usable and accessible to all of the students. There's nobody excluded for any sort of reason, because if they're being excluded because of the technology, you probably shouldn't be using it, I suppose. This was info dumping was one of the big kind of criticism leveled at online courses previously, whereas it was just a huge amount of information was dumped forward onto the student, and they're expected to self-study without any focus on learner training or anything like that. And info dumping is obviously something we want to avoid. We don't want to just click on a URL, a website, and send it to the students and say, do questions 1 to 20, and I'll see you in 20 minutes. We do want to actually break up the material, parse it in some way, and deliver it step by step so we can monitor and assess success, and we can then be there to provide support for the students. And then lastly, learner training in the use of the technology. And I think this is something which we maybe have presumed the learners will be a little bit more literate, I suppose, in the utilization of certain digital medias. But this presumption, again, creates a barrier because we have to really focus on how they are using the material and how they're actually engaging with the technology, and whether they're not comfortable with it or not, and whether we can provide some sort of training. So that's why I always suggest, if you are going to use a new tool or a new platform, give the students 10-15 minutes of a kind of a really slow run through of what that might look like, or even create a little video tutorial of how they're actually going to use the platform, or what you would expect them to do on the platform. And then what are the benefits? Is it a platform that you're choosing just because it looks cool, or is it actually solving a problem for you in the classroom? And again, with technology, we've come back to teacher training and these competencies. And I go back to the Equals Teacher Development Framework, and this is in 3 different stages. So this would be stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 for the teacher's development. And this is in ICT competencies. So we've got obviously certain ones which would have been a little bit more relevant in a face-to-face context, but some of these are certainly to be considered in an online context, in our context currently. So this would be the base level skills here. Can you do all of these things? And these would be second level, and this would be third level. And it's worthwhile to actually go through some of these competency frameworks and see, can I actually do all of those things? And then when I'm confident enough with that, can I move on and see if I can do the second level with some sort of fluency, competency. Also with technology, and we go back to this this from blended learning, when we're choosing technology and to use in a classroom, we typically focus on the SAMIR model. And this is the idea of, is technology enhancing learning in the classroom, or is it focusing on transforming learning in the classroom? When we talk about enhancement, we're really at the base level talking about substitution or potentially augmentation. Substitution could be, rather than having a paper handout, you can email the student a PDF or a Word document. This is just direct substitution. There's no functional change in that. Augmentation could be, rather than giving the student a paper handout, you send them a link to a website where they can fill in their questions, and they can get feedback on whether the answer is wrong or right. So there's a small functional improvement in that, maybe. But really what we're looking at is the utilization of certain platforms in order to transform learning. So we take the example that I said about Google Documents, using Google Documents for peer correction or something like that, where it's something you can't really do asynchronously or even synchronously with a large body of students. And it's something which could be a useful use of Google Documents or any other tool, note sharing tool. We've also got Google Classroom, and how you can use certain VLEs like Google Classroom or Flipgrid to promote student collaboration, student task-based learning for homework on a long-term basis. And these are ways we can use technology to transform. But I think when we're choosing certain tools and platforms, we have to consider what they're doing in the classroom. Are they just a direct substitution, or can I begin to use them to modify and even redefine how learning is happening in the classroom? And looking at this model, it actually hopefully allows people to be a little bit more excited about technology, that it's not just a transferable thing, but it's actually something which, once harnessed and we're actually properly trained to use, we can really utilize it to the benefit of our students and make things a little bit easier for ourselves, hopefully. Um, I want to move away from technology for a second. Well, not fully move away from technology, I suppose, but to think about the institution and what an online institution looks like. And this is it's a consideration for a lot of teachers in the past year who, as I said, maybe feel or have felt abandoned or have felt a little bit alone, um, primarily because they haven't got a staff room, they haven't got colleagues, they haven't got the support of management, maybe they haven't got regular training in certain things, they aren't being observed, maybe they aren't getting that feedback on their performance. Um, so the institution has to think, how can I do all of these things? How can I set up observations and actually give teachers feedback on best practice? What does the institution know what best practice looks like? Do they know what they want the teachers to do in the classroom? Are they going to then observe that? Are they going to record lessons and watch them and give feedback? Are they going to actually go into online lessons and give feedback? The second consideration for an institution is safeguarding. And this is not only safeguarding the teacher and ensuring that the teacher isn't being messaged inappropriately in the chat or emailed or whatever, but it's also safeguarding students and ensuring that you have a camera policy and things like that. These are important considerations which don't exist in a face-to-face context, but are really things which we need to consider, especially for teaching young learners. The school also has to ensure that there are clear channels of communication. Every party, every stakeholder involved knows how they are going to communicate with the relevant bodies. And this is primarily due to the fact that in some circumstances, teachers were the only point of contact for students, and this is it's very overwhelming when you don't even have colleagues around you to support you, and it can lead to teacher burnout very, very quickly. So it is something which schools have to address, and schools have to ensure that the teacher is primarily dealing with the academic context and also learning how to teach in an online context, which is already taking up a huge amount of kind of stress and brain space. We also have to look at material, and National Geographic, for example, have done some good work in creating their course books for online context, their ebooks and other materials to support it. And we do have to think about that. The material which we typically might have used, photocopiable material or paper course books, do we have a policy on, is the school going to have recommended material? Are they going to ensure that the students get books? Are they going to actually be able to pay certain subscriptions to certain online content forums or things like that? So the school has to perform the same function that they would have done in a face-to-face context in an online context. And lastly, we've got to focus on that, the staff room. And I think one of the key things that we are missing is that we're in this period of massive unknown for a lot of teachers, and this idea of reciprocal vulnerability and being able to actually say to your colleagues, I don't know how to do this, can I get some help? And being able to go down and have a cup of tea with your colleagues and share certain stories in order to build up this best practice. This is missing a lot of the time. Not only is it missing from a mental health perspective, but also from academic development perspective. So it's a consideration for the school whether you can provide online staff room, whether you can encourage some sort of staff collaboration, whether it's action research projects or professional development groups or something which gives the teachers a purpose to come together and promotes that encouragement and development academically, and as I said, in terms of the mental health. We do fundamentally have to look at what the learner is experiencing. When we're talking about the learner experience, the teacher experience as well, we always go back to the apprenticeship of observation. The apprenticeship of observation is basically you as a student in primary and secondary school built up this body of knowledge of what a school looks like, what a class typically looks like, what a teacher should do, what a student should do, and generally how the learning process should proceed. And if you moved on to train as a teacher, you brought this apprenticeship with you, and you engaged with pedagogical material, and you began to build upon this knowledge. But that apprenticeship of observation is always with you. It's always, you have an idea of what a lesson looks like, even if you disagree with the lessons you received. You have enough knowledge to know why you disagreed, maybe. The learners frequently don't have, and we don't have any experience of observing an online class. So perhaps they don't really know what a good online class looks like. And this can be really, really tricky when getting feedback on the success of certain lessons. If you're actually trying to ask students, what you would want, what they want to do, or what they thought about the lesson, they don't really have a frame of reference. So I think we have to really think about the importance of that, and how we can work with the students to I suppose, to get their feelings on the lesson, on the progress of online learning, and try to pick holes in their opinions, and try to actually tease out what is really happening in their own experiences, in their own engagement with the lessons. This is going to be a really, really difficult process, but I think it's really vital to have that student voice. As I said before, we need to ensure that we're including everybody, and ensuring everyone has access. And again, this can be including the student voice to actually get feedback on whether they feel included, whether they feel like they have any access issues or something like that. There's also engagement, motivation with materials and lessons in an online context. It's very very easy to get distracted, I suppose, as students, especially younger learners, when they don't have their classmates around, and they've got their phone there, and they're already on the internet, and they can kind of drift in and out of lessons because they can hide a little bit more from the teacher. We have to try to think, how can we make lessons a little bit more engaging? How can we try to transfer that motivation, which we were good at developing in a face-to-face context? How can we transfer that into an online context? So I move on to consider the future of education. And as I said, I'm not going to give any sweeping predictions, but I do think that this last year has certainly fast forwarded certain things, and brought a number of issues into clearer focus, I suppose. In my experience, and maybe you agree or disagree, I don't know, but certainly a lot of students who have experienced online learning over the past year have expressed a strong desire to return to face-to-face learning. And this is, obviously there's a number of factors in the idea that people want to get back to some degree of normality. But I do think that there are limitations to the online context of learning, which are really difficult to bridge without, kind of long-term training and long-term building up of a body of best practice. And I think that, students are eager to get back to what they might see as something which they're more familiar with, and certainly something that the students are more, or the teachers are more proficient at. I also think with a lot of people, that the whole experience of education and what you actually learn in the non-classroom times, and when the teacher isn't there, or in the class in general, what you might learn is so valuable, that I think students might be missing that in an online context. They don't have that collegiality, I suppose you could call it. We also have to consider the socially distant classroom, and this is the classroom which we are experiencing now currently in the UK and Ireland. And this is a classroom which has reduced numbers. Students are in masks. The class is well ventilated. Everybody is sanitized. And the classes are static. And when I say static, I mean that there's no movement of the students around the class during the lesson. There's no games which involve movement. There's no changing of seats, anything like that. All of your activities must be static, and the teacher is at the top of the class presenting the lesson. So there's limitations to how this can play out based on the pre-COVID classroom. And in a lot of contexts, a lot of situations, teachers have actually brought what they used in an online context back into the classroom and try to use some of these online tools to solve some of the problems of the socially distant classroom. And this could involve using something like voice recording, Vocaroo, to do speaking tests and to share them in the Google Classroom, because the teacher cannot, take the student outside and do a speaking test, for example, because of space and distancing. So there are big considerations for the socially distant classroom and what that's going to look like for the next 6 months, 8 months, and how we can ensure that it's relatively seamless. And again, a lot of institutions are building up this body of best practice in terms of the SDC, and I think it is something which again, once we come out of it and once we go back to classrooms which are non-distant and face-to-face, that there's going to be a huge body of learning which we're going to be able to use to hopefully progress the profession. We also need to look at blended and hybrid learning, and there's obviously a huge amount of things covered under the heading of blended learning, but essentially it's the utilization of technology within the classroom or in an asynchronous context as a homework or a flipped classroom task. And blended has already been, I think, pretty popular, and it's becoming more and more popular as teachers realize that some of the tools which they used in an online context are really useful, and they solve problems which they couldn't solve before. And the last consideration is this hybrid learning classroom, this hybrid learning context. And this is a context where in its modern application, the teacher has a class of face-to-face students, but also there's a screen with online students joining the class or zooming into the class, and they are doing the same material, and frequently they're paired with face-to-face students. They can work in pairs together, they can collaborate, and it has been successful in several contexts, but again, it's a massive training area for teachers to be able to deal with two particular groups of students and ensure that they're all monitored, assessed, and learning is kind of happening as successfully as you can imagine. But certainly it's something which is going to be a fixture for 2021. My final consideration. So again, if you haven't listened at all for the last 48 minutes, if you just listen for the next 2 minutes, it's pretty much everything. I guess with online teaching, we again need to go back to teacher competencies and focus on certain teacher competencies and the honing of these bridging competencies, these ones which we need in order to take ourselves from successful face-to-face teachers into successful online teachers. The online context is different, but the number one thing is identifying the problems, identifying what issues you think you are having with online teaching, finding out what your known problems are, because when you go into it, there's loads of unknown problems, and we have to begin to say, actually, I'm not sure if I know the students are paying attention, or I'm not sure if they understand my instructions or whatever. And then we are looking at technological solutions, and there's loads of different tools and VLEs that we can use to solve some of these problems. And you can see from the chat box, teachers are already solving the problems. They've already begun to identify certain problems and found certain solutions. So there's a lot of work already being done, a lot of shortcuts that you can take, and I think it's time to use this body of knowledge as well. Future classrooms, not only in ELT, I think in all contexts, the blending of synchronous and asynchronous learning will become more prominent. When I say synchronous learning, I mean learning in the live space, and asynchronous, I mean traditionally what we'd call homework. And with the use of technology, we can blend them a little bit more seamlessly. And I think it is something which is here to stay, because the flipped classroom, or aspects of the flipped classroom, the promotion of learner independence, I think, is really, really important. And these are all going to help us do it. These tools are all going to help us do this if we choose them wisely, because it's very easy to to overburden students and teachers with too many tools that are a bit gimmicky and don't actually do what you want them to do. And I think having a kind of a toolkit of 6 or 7 platforms or tools that you use regularly and you use them well, and the students know what they're doing, I think that should be enough. That should be sufficient. It's just about choosing which ones that you like to use and how to use. And I think that's really your and that you don't require a login for everything. Some of them that are open access, or maybe. So that would be a general overview. I tried to finish slightly earlier so I could have time for questions if possible. Emily.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for that great session. If anyone has any questions, like Chris mentioned, we do have some time, so you can just pop them into the question box, the Q&A one. Someone just asked, what is the difference between blended learning and hybrid?
Oi, oi, oi. So one of the problems with hybrid is that frequently it hasn't actually got a strong definition yet. People are calling different things hybrid, but the majority of people agree that hybrid looks like 2 sets of students. So face-to-face students and online students participating in the same lesson. That is what hybrid learning would look like to a lot of people. Whereas blended learning is a face-to-face context, just face-to-face students, but you're utilizing technology as a big part of the lesson, as a big part of the course. So they might at the flipped classroom, they might be doing all of their input sessions as videos for homework, and then they're just doing speaking task in class. So that would be a blended context, but it's one group of one type of student, I suppose. Hybrid would be 2 types of student, I guess.
Sounds good.
Digital and online, I think I just transferred those 2. Sorry, someone asked the difference in digital and online teaching. The same. I think it's the same. Sorry, Emily, go ahead.
No, it's perfect. That was the question I saw too. Let's look back. How many are too many apps / platforms for students to handle? Luz asked.
I just pulled a random. I said 7. We've always used 7 just because I think once you go beyond, I probably use about 5. I think I use about 5 regularly. And if you look at some of the videos that I put up, there's 5 that, like, Google Classroom does a huge amount for you, and then you might need a website that you use, like EdTed or TED Talks is pretty useful as well. And there's so much content on a lot of these platforms that you don't need so many. My reckoning would be choose 5 or 6, get really comfortable with them, and after a month add another one, then add another one. Then you might build up a kind of a bit of a bigger toolkit as you go along, I think.
We got a few more here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one question about promoting engagement when students maybe not able to turn on their cameras.
Yeah.
From Mary.
So one thing I always do in terms of there's loads of different ways you can promote engagement. One thing I always do with that video camera situation, motivation, monitoring, is I ask my students at the start of every class to open up a Google Doc and to share it in the chat and use it as their notes. So all the way through the lesson, they're writing their notes, their whatever grammar presentation, whatever they're doing, and you can have all of their docs open as different tabs, and you can just go from tab to tab. And if one student is not writing notes or they're writing the wrong notes, you can message them and say, what's the situation? And you can use that as monitoring. In terms of engagement, what I've always tried to do is have a task where the students arrive, if possible, can arrive in the class 10 minutes early and do a collaborative task with somebody, so that by the time you actually begin the lesson, they've already begun to discuss something. I know there's a couple of different ideas.
And I just posted a link in the chat box for a few for the archive for online teaching webinars that we have. And a lot of those have tips on engaging your students in the online class, which a lot of these questions are about. This is one that came up at the earlier session too, but is it advisable to reduce the learning outcomes?
Yeah, this is what I do. I think in our current context, because we don't like the learning outcomes that we typically use in a face-to-face context. We usually, for in a lot of situations, we had a really good idea of how they were going to play out, and we might have done them a couple of times before. And in an online context, the way the learners are going to engage with the material, the way they're actually engaging with the lessons in general, it's going to be at a different level. We don't know if it's going to be at the same speed, better or worse. So I think lowering the expectations and being able to monitor and assess step by step until we really understand what's happening, I don't think it's a negative at all. I think it's quite prudent, actually.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. All right, it seems like a good time to wrap up. We're just about at time. So first, thanks so much, Chris.
No, thank you. Thanks a million.
Great. And thank you everyone for staying with us. We have about 235 people here, 34. So thanks all for joining us and staying with us for an hour and being so engaged and answering all the questions Chris asked and just giving us your input on your experience. So it was great to hear. So thank you for being active participants. All get A's.
Thank you, guys. Ciao, ciao.
Just a few things as we wrap up. You will be sent along a certificate for joining us, the recording, as well as a PDF of the slides within 5 business days. So just stay tuned for that. We also put the recording and slides up on our webinar site. If you haven't checked that out, we have a full archive of previous sessions. So you can be sure to look at that. There's a variety of categories, whether you're teaching in person, in a blend, or online. We have a lot of different webinars on a lot of different topics. So encourage you to check those out. We will be taking a little bit of a break until January on webinars. This is the last one in 2020, but be on the lookout for schedule updates soon. If you're subscribed to notifications, you'll be on that email list and you'll get updates when we release the new schedule. So we hope to see you again in the new year. We hope everyone has a happy new year and stay safe, and yeah, happy teaching.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. I'll send you all to the feedback survey now. Love to hear what you thought of the session, and take care. Have a great rest of your evening or afternoon or morning if you're in Asia. All right, bye.